The Wisdom of Being Religious, Sermon 1 by John Tillotson. Quote, "And unto man he said, Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding." End quote. Job chapter 28, verse 8. In this chapter, Job discourseth of the secrets of nature and the unsearchable perfections of the works of God. And the result of his discourse is this, that a perfect knowledge of nature is nowhere to be found but in the author of it, no less wisdom and understanding than that which made the world, and contrived the vast and regular frame of nature, can thoroughly understand the philosophy of it, and comprehend so vast a design. But yet there is a knowledge which is very proper to man, and lies level to human understanding, and that is the knowledge of our Creator, and of the duty we owe to him, the wisdom of pleasing God by doing what he commands and avoiding what he forbids. This knowledge and wisdom may be attained by man, and is sufficient to make him happy. Quote, "And unto man he said, Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding." End quote. These words consist of two propositions, which are not distinct in sense, but one and the same thing variously expressed. For wisdom and understanding are synonymous words here, and, though sometimes they have different notions, yet in the poetical books of Scripture they are most frequently used as words equivalent, and do both of them indifferently signify either a speculative knowledge of things or a practical skill about them, according to the exigency of the matter or thing spoken of. And so, likewise, the fear of the Lord and departure from evil are phrases of a very near sense and like importance, and therefore we find them several times put together in Scripture. Quote, "Fear the Lord and depart from evil," end quote. Quote, "By the fear of the Lord men depart from evil," end quote. So that they differ only as cause and effect, which by a metonymy, usual in all sorts of authors, are frequently put one for another. Now, to, quote, "fear the Lord," end quote, and to, quote, "depart from evil," end quote, are phrases which the Scripture useth in a very great latitude to express to us the sum of religion and the whole of our duty. And, because the large usage of these phrases is to be the foundation of my following discourse, I shall, for the farther clearing of this matter, endeavour to show these two things. 1. That it is very usual in the language of Scripture to express the whole of religion by these and such like phrases. 2. The particular fitness of these two phrases to describe religion. 1. It is very usual in the language of Scripture to express the whole of religion by some eminent principle or part of religion. The great principles of religion are knowledge, faith, remembrance, love, and fear, by all which the Scripture useth to express the whole duty of man. In the Old Testament, by the knowledge, remembrance, and fear of God, religion is called, quote, "the knowledge of the holy," end quote, and wicked men are described to be such as, quote, "know not God," end quote. So likewise, by the fear of the Lord, frequently in the book of Job, and in the Psalms and Proverbs, and, quote, "then they that feared the Lord spake often one to another," end quote. And the fear of God is expressly said to be the sum of religion, quote, "fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man," end quote. And, on the contrary, the wicked are described to be such as, quote, "have not the fear of God before their eyes," end quote. And so, likewise, by the remembrance of God, quote, "remember thy Creator in the days of thy youth," end quote. That is, enter upon a religious course betimes. And, on the contrary, the character of the wicked is that they forget God, quote, "the wicked shall be turned into hell, and all the nations that forget God," end quote. In the New Testament, religion is usually expressed by faith in God and Christ, and the love of them. Hence it is that true Christians are so frequently called believers, and wicked and ungodly men unbelievers, and that good men are described to be such as love God, quote, "all things shall work together for good to them that love God," end quote, and such as, quote, love the Lord Jesus Christ, end quote. Now, the reason why these are put for the whole of religion is because the belief and knowledge and remembrance and love and fear of God are such powerful principles and have so great an influence upon men to make them religious, that where any one of these really is, all the rest, together with the true and genuine effects of them, are supposed to be. And so, likewise, the sum of all religion is often expressed by some eminent part of it, which will explain the second phrase here in the text, departing from evil. The worship of God is an eminent part of religion, and prayer, which is often in Scripture expressed by seeking God and calling upon his name, is a chief part of religious worship. Hence religion is described by seeking God. Quote, "He is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him," end quote, and by calling upon his name. Quote, "Whosoever calleth upon the name of the Lord shall be saved," end quote. And so, by coming to God and by departing from evil. In this fallen state of man, religion begins with repentance and conversion, the two opposite terms of which are God and sin. Hence it is that religion is described sometimes by coming to God. Quote, "He that cometh to God must believe that he is," end quote. That is, no man can be religious unless he believe there is a God. Sometimes by departing from sin. Quote, "And he that departeth from evil maketh himself a prey," end quote. That is, such was the bad state of those times of which the prophet there complains, that no man could be religious, but he was in danger of being persecuted. 2. For the fitness of these two phrases to describe religion. 1. For the first, quote, "the fear of the Lord," end quote. The fitness of this phrase will appear if we consider how great an influence the fear of God hath upon men to make them religious. Fear is a passion that is most deeply rooted in our natures, and flows immediately from that principle of self-preservation which God hath planted in every man. Every one desires his own preservation and happiness, and therefore hath a natural dread and horror of everything that can destroy his being or endanger his happiness. And the greatest danger is from the greatest power, and that is omnipotency, so that the fear of God is an inward acknowledgement of a holy and just being, which is armed with an almighty and irresistible power, God having hid in every man's conscience a secret awe and dread of his infinite power and eternal justice. Now, fear being so intimate to our natures, it is the strongest bond of laws and the great security of our duty. There are two bridles or restraints which God hath put upon human nature, shame and fear. Shame is the weaker, and hath place only in those in whom there are some remainders of virtue. Fear is the stronger, and works upon all who love themselves and desire their own preservation. Therefore, in this degenerate state of mankind, fear is that passion which hath the greatest power over us, and by which God and his laws take the surest hold of us. Our desire and love and hope are not so apt to be wrought upon by the representation of virtue and the promises of reward and happiness, as our fear is from the apprehension of divine displeasure. For though we have lost, in a great measure, the love and relish of true happiness, yet we still retain a quick sense of pain and misery, so that fear relies upon a natural love of ourselves, and is complicated with a necessary desire of our own preservation. And therefore religion usually makes its first entrance into us by this passion. Hence, perhaps, it is that Solomon, more than once, calls the fear of the Lord the, quote, "beginning of wisdom," end quote. 2. As for the second phrase, quote, "departing from evil," end quote, the fitness of it to express the whole duty of man will appear if we consider the necessary connection that is between the negative and the positive part of our duty. He that is careful to avoid all sin will sincerely endeavour to perform his duty. For the soul of man is an active principle, and will be employed one way or other. It will be doing something. If a man abstain from evil, he will do good. Now, there being such a straight connection between these, the whole of our duty may be expressed by either of them, but most fitly by departing from evil, because that is the first part of our duty. Religion begins in the forsaking of sin. Virtue begins in the forsaking of vice, and the first part of wisdom is not to be a fool. And therefore, the The Scripture, which mentions these parts of our duty, doth constantly put departing from evil first. Quote, depart from evil and do good. End quote. Quote, cease to do evil, learn to do well. End quote. Quote, let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him turn unto the Lord. End quote. We are first to, quote, put off the old man, which is corrupt according to deceitful lusts, end quote, and then to, quote, be renewed in the spirit of our minds, and to put on the new man, end quote, etc. Let him, quote, eschew evil and do good, end quote. To all which I may add this farther consideration, that the law of God, contained in the 10 Commandments, consisting mostly of prohibitions, thou shalt not do such or such a thing, our observance of it is mostly fitly expressed by departing from evil, which yet includes obedience likewise to the positive precepts implied in those prohibitions. Having thus explained the words, I come now to consider the proposition contained in them, which is this: that religion is the best knowledge and wisdom. This I shall endeavour to make good these 3 ways. 1. By a direct proof of it. 2. By showing, on the contrary, the folly and ignorance of irreligion and wickedness. 3. By vindicating religion from those common imputations which seem to charge it with ignorance or imprudence. I begin with the direct proof of this, and, because religion comprehends 2 things, the knowledge of the principles of it, and a suitable life and practice, the first of which, being speculative, may more properly be called knowledge, and the latter, because it is practical, may be called wisdom or prudence. Therefore, I shall endeavour distinctly to prove these 2 things. 1. That religion is the best knowledge. 2. That it is the truest wisdom. 1. First, that it is the best knowledge. The knowledge of religion commends itself to us upon these 2 accounts. 1. It is the knowledge of those things which are in themselves most excellent. 2. Of those things which are most useful and necessary for us to know. First, it is the best knowledge, because it is the knowledge of those things which are in themselves most excellent and desirable to be known, and those are God and our duty. God is the sum and comprehension of all perfection. It is delightful to know the creatures, because there are particular excellencies scattered and dispersed among them, which are some shadows of the divine perfections. But in God all perfections in their highest degree and exaltation meet together and are united. How much more delightful then must it needs be to fix our minds upon such an object, in which there is nothing but beauty and brightness, what is amiable and what is excellent, what will ravish our affections and raise our wonder, please us and astonish us at once, and that the finite measure and capacity of our understandings is not able to take in and comprehend the infinite perfections of God. This, indeed, shows the excellency of the object, but doth not altogether take away the delightfulness of the knowledge. For as it is pleasant to the eye to have an endless prospect, so it is some pleasure to a finite understanding to view unlimited excellencies, which have no shore or bounds, though it cannot comprehend them. There is a pleasure in admiration, and this is that which properly causeth admiration, when we discover a great deal in an object which we understand to be excellent, and yet we see we know not how much more beyond that, which our understandings cannot fully reach and comprehend. And as the knowledge of God in his nature and perfections is excellent and desirable, so likewise to know him in those glorious manifestations of himself in the works of creation and providence, and above all, in that stupendous work of the redemption of the world by Jesus Christ, which was such a mystery and so excellent a piece of knowledge that the angels are said to, quote, desire to pry into it, end quote. And as the knowledge of God is excellent, so likewise of our duty, which is nothing else but virtue and goodness and holiness, which are the image of God, a conformity to the nature and will of God, and an imitation of the divine excellencies and perfections, so far as we are capable. For to know our duty is to know what it is to be like God in goodness and piety, and patience and clemency. in pardoning injuries and passing by provocations, in justice and righteousness, in truth and faithfulness, and in a hatred and detestation of the contrary of these. In a word, it is to know what is the good and acceptable will of God, what it is that he loves and delights in, and is pleased withal, and would have us to do in order to our perfection and our happiness. It is deservedly accounted a piece of excellent knowledge to know the laws of the land, and the customs of the country we live in, and the will of the prince we live under. How much more to know the statutes of heaven, and the laws of eternity, those immutable and eternal rules of justice and righteousness, to know the will and pleasure of the great monarch and universal king of the world, and the customs of that country where we must live forever. This made David to admire the law of God at that strange rate, and to advance the knowledge of it above all other knowledge. Quote, I have seen an end of all perfection, but thy commandment is exceeding broad. End quote. Secondly, it is the knowledge of those things which are most useful and necessary for us to know. The goodness of everything is measured by its end and use, and that is the best thing which serves the best end and purpose. The more necessary anything is to such an end, the better it is. So that the best knowledge is that which is of greatest use and necessity to us, in order to our great end, which is eternal happiness at the salvation of our souls. Curious speculations, and the contemplation of things that are impertinent to us, and do not concern us, nor serve to promote our happiness, are but a more specious and ingenious sort of idleness, a more pardonable and credible kind of ignorance. That man that doth not know these things which are of use and necessity for him to know, is but an ignorant man, whatever he may know besides. Now, the knowledge of God and of Christ, and of our duty, is of the greatest usefulness and necessity to us, in order to our happiness. It is of absolute necessity that we should know God and Christ, in order to our being happy. Quote, this is life eternal, that is, the only way to it, to know thee, the only true God, and him whom thou hast sent, Jesus Christ. End quote. It is necessary also, in order to our happiness, to know our duty, because it is necessary for us to do it, and it is impossible to do it except we know it. So that whatever other knowledge a man may be endued withal, he is but an ignorant person who doth not know God, the author of his being, the preserver and protector of his life, his sovereign and his judge, the giver of every good and perfect gift, his surest refuge in trouble, his best friend or worst enemy, the present support of his life, his hopes in death, his future happiness, and his portion for ever. Who does not know his relation to God, the duty that he owes him, and the way to please him, who can make him happy or miserable for ever? Who doth not know the Lord Jesus Christ, who is, quote, the way, the truth, and the life, end quote. If a man, by a vast and imperious mind, and a heart large as the sand upon the seashore, as it is said of Solomon, could command all the knowledge of nature and art, of words and things, could attain to a mastery in all languages, and sound the depths of all arts and sciences, measure the earth and the heaven, and tell the stars, and declare their order and motions, could discourse of the interests of all states, the intrigues of all courts, the reason of all civil laws and constitutions, and give an account of the history of all ages, could speak of trees, quote, from the cedar tree that is in Lebanon, even unto the hyssop that springs out of the wall, and of beasts also, and of fowls, and of creeping things, and of fishes, end quote, and yet should, in the meantime, be destitute of the knowledge of God and Christ, and his duty, all this would be but an impertinent vanity, and a more glittering kind of ignorance. And such a man, like the philosopher who, whilst he was gazing upon the stars, fell into the ditch, would but be undone with all this knowledge, and with a great deal of wisdom go down to hell. 2. Secondly, that to be religious is the truest wisdom, and that likewise upon two accounts. 1. Because it is to be wise for ourselves. 2. It is to be wise as to our main interest and concernment. 1. It is to be wise for ourselves. There is an expression, Job chapter 20, verse 21, quote, he that is wise is profitable to himself, end quote, and Proverbs chapter 9, verse 12, quote, "If thou be wise, thou shalt be wise for thyself," end quote, intimating that wisdom regards a man's own interest and advantage, and that he is not a wise man that doth not take care of himself and his own concernments, according to that of old Ennius, that man hath but an empty title of wisdom, and is not really wise, who is not wise for himself. As self-preservation is the first principle of nature, so care of ourselves and our own interest is the first part of wisdom. He that is wise in the affairs and concernments of other men, but careless and negligent of his own, that man may be said to be busy, but he is not wise. He is employed indeed, but not so as a wise man should be. Now this is the wisdom of religion, that it directs a man to a care of his own proper interest and concernment. 2. It is to be wise as to our main interest. Our chief end and highest interest is happiness, and this is happiness, to be freed from all, if it may, however from the greatest, evils, and to enjoy, if it may be, all good, however the chiefest. To be happy is not only to be freed from the pains and diseases of the body, but from anxiety and vexation of spirit, not only to enjoy the pleasures of sense, but peace of conscience and tranquillity of mind. To be happy is not only to be so for a little while, but as long as may be, and, if it be possible, for ever. Now religion designs our greatest and longest happiness. It aims at a freedom from the greatest evils, and to bring us to the possession and enjoyment of the greatest good. For religion wisely considers that men have immortal spirits, which, as they are spirits, are capable of a pleasure and happiness distinct from that of our bodies and our senses, and because they are immortal, are capable of an everlasting happiness. Now, our souls being the best parts of ourselves, and eternity being infinitely the most considerable duration, the greatest wisdom is to secure the interest of our souls and of eternity, though it be with loss and to the prejudice of our temporal and inferior interests. Therefore, religion directs us rather to secure inward peace than outward ease, to be more careful to avoid everlasting and intolerable torment than short and, quote, light afflictions which are but for a moment, end quote, to court the favour of God more than the friendship of the world, and not so much to, quote, fear them that can kill the body, and after that have no more that they can do, end quote, as, quote, him who after he hath killed can destroy both body and soul in hell, end quote. In a word, our main interest is to be as happy as we can, and as long as is possible. And if we be cast into such circumstances that we must be either in part and for a time, or else wholly and always miserable, the best wisdom is to choose the greatest and most lasting happiness, but the least and shortest misery. Upon this account religion prefers those pleasures which flow from the presence of God for evermore, infinitely before the transitory pleasures of this world, and is much more careful to avoid eternal misery than present sufferings. This is the wisdom of religion, that upon consideration of the whole, and casting up all things together, it does advise and lead us to our best interest. 2. The second way of confirmation should be by endeavouring to show the ignorance and folly of irreligion. Now all that are irreligious are so upon one of these two accounts, either, first, because they do not believe the foundations and principles of religion, as the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, and future rewards, or else, secondly, because though they do in some sort believe these things, yet they live contrary to this their belief, and of this kind are the far greatest part of wicked men. The first sort are guilty of that which we call speculative, the other of practical atheism. I shall endeavour to show the ignorance and folly of both these. First, speculative atheism is unreasonable, and that upon these 5 accounts. 1. Because it gives no tolerable account of the existence of the world. 2. Nor does it give any reasonable account of the universal consent of mankind in this apprehension that there is a God. 3. It requires more evidence for things than they are capable of. 4. The atheist pretends to know that which no man can know. 5. Atheism contradicts itself. 1. Because it gives no tolerable account of the existence of the world. One of the greatest difficulties that lies in the atheist's way is, upon his own supposition that there is no God, to give a likely account of the existence of the world. We see this vast frame of the world, and an innumerable multitude of creatures in it, all which we, who believe a God, attribute to him as the author of them. For a being, supposed of infinite goodness and wisdom and power, is a very likely cause of these things. What more likely to make this vast world, to stretch forth the heavens, and lay the foundations of the earth, and to form these and all things in them of nothing, than infinite power? What more likely to communicate being, and so many degrees of happiness to so many several sorts of creatures, than infinite goodness? What more likely to contrive this admirable frame of the universe, and all the creatures in it, each of them so perfect in their kind, and all of them so fitted to each other and to the whole, than infinite counsel and wisdom? This seems to be no unreasonable account. But let us see now what account the atheist gives of these things. If there be no God, there are but these two ways imaginable for the world to be. Either, it must be said, that not only the matter but also the frame of this world is eternal, and that, as to the main, things always were as they are, without any first cause of their being, which is the way of the Aristotelian atheist, those, I mean, who proceed upon Aristotle's supposition of the eternity of the world, but yet deny it to be from God, which he expressly asserts. Or else the matter of the world, being supposed to be eternal and of itself, the original of this vast and beautiful frame must be ascribed merely to chance, and the causal concourse of the parts of matter, which is the way of the Epicurean atheist. But neither of these ways gives a tolerable account of the existence of the world. 1. I shall first consider the hypothesis of those whom, for distinction's sake, I call the Aristotelian atheists, which is this: that not only the matter but also the frame of the world is eternal, and that, as to the main, it was always as it is, of itself, and that there hath been from all eternity a succession of men and other creatures without any first cause of their being. It seems to be very hard, and if that would do any good, might be just matter of complaint, that we are fallen into so profane and sceptical an age, which takes a pleasure and a pride in unravelling almost all the received principles both of religion and reason, so that we are put many times to prove those things, which can hardly be made plainer than they are of themselves. And such almost are these principles, that God is, and that all things were made by him, which by reason of the bold cavils of perverse and unreasonable men we are nowadays put to defend. That something is of itself is evident, because we see things are, and the things that we see must either have had some first cause of their being, or have been always and of themselves. One of these two is unavoidable. So that the controversy between us and this sort of atheists comes to this: which is the more credible opinion, that the world was never made nor had a beginning, but always was as it is, and that there hath been from all eternity a succession of men and other creatures without any first cause of their being, or that there was from all eternity such a being as we conceive God to be, infinite in power, goodness, and wisdom, which made us and all other things. The first of these opinions I shall show to be altogether incredible, and the latter to have all the credibility and evidence of which a thing of that nature is capable, and such evidence as is sufficient to convince any impartial and considerate man. Now, in comparing the probabilities of things, that we may know which side the advantage lies, these two considerations are of great moment: what the arguments are on each side, and what the difficulties. For if there be fair proofs on the one side, and none at all on the other, and if the most pressing difficulties be on that side on which there are no proofs, this is sufficient to render one opinion very credible, and the other altogether incredible. These two things, therefore, I shall endeavour to make good, in the matter that is now under our consideration. First, that there are fair proofs on our side, and as convincing as the nature of the thing is capable of, but that there is no pretence of proof on the other. And, secondly, that the side on which there is no proof is encumbered with the greatest difficulties. First, that there are fair proofs on our side, and as convincing as the nature of the thing is capable of, but that there is no pretense of proof on the other. This question, whether the world was created and had a beginning or not, is a question concerning an ancient matter of fact, which can only be decided these two ways, by testimony and by probabilities of reason. Testimony is the principal argument in a matter of this nature, and if fair probabilities of reason concur with it, this argument hath all the strength it can have. Now both these are clearly on the affirmative side of the question, viz., that the world was created and had a beginning. 1. Testimony, of which there be two kinds, divine and human. Divine testimony, as such, is not proper to be used in this cause, considering the occasion of the present debate, for that would be to beg the first and main question now in controversy, which is, whether there be a God or not, which a testimony from God does suppose, and therefore ought not to be brought for the proof of it. It is true, indeed, that those effects of divine power, I mean miracles, which will prove a divine testimony to an infidel, will as well prove the being of a God to an atheist. But when we dispute against those who deny a God, no testimony ought to be presumed to be from God, but must be proved to be so, and whatever argument proves that will also prove that there is a God. Human testimonies are of two sorts, universal tradition and written history. Both these are plainly and beyond dispute on our side. First, there is an universal tradition concerning the beginning of the world, and that it was made by God. And for the evidence of this, we have the concurring tradition of the most ancient nations, the Egyptians and Phoenicians, and of the most barbarous, the Indians, who, as Strabo tells us, quote, did in many things agree with the Grecians, particularly in this, that the world did begin and should have an end, and that God, the maker and governor of it, is present in all parts of it, end quote. And Acosta tells us that at the first discovery of America, the inhabitants of Peru did worship one chief God, under the name or title of the maker of the universe, and yet these people had not had any commerce with the other known parts of the world, for God knows how many ages. To which may be added, that the most ancient of the philosophers, and those that were the heads of the chief sects of philosophy, as Thales, Anaxagoras, and Pythagoras, did likewise consent to this tradition. Particularly concerning Thales, Tully tells us that he was the first of all the philosophers, quote, that inquired into these things, and he said that water was the beginning of all things, and that God was that mind, or intelligent principle, which fashioned all things out of water, end quote. So likewise Strabo informs us that the Brahmans, the chief sect of philosophers among the Indians, agreed with the Grecians in this, quote, that the world was made of water, end quote, which agrees exactly with Moses' account of the creation, viz., quote, that the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, end quote, which St. Peter expresses thus, quote, that by the word of God, the heavens and the earth, for so the Hebrews called the world, were of old constituted or made of water, end quote, not, quote, standing out of the water, end quote, as our translation renders it. Nay, Aristotle himself, who was the great asserter of the eternity of the world, gives this account why the gods were anciently represented by the heathens as swearing by the lake Styx, because water was supposed to be the principle of all things. And this, he tells us, was the most ancient opinion concerning the original of the world, and that the very oldest writers of theology, and those who lived at the greatest distance from his time, were of this mind. And in the book De Mundo, it is freely acknowledged to have been an ancient saying and a general tradition among all men, quote, that all things are of God, and were made by him, end quote. I will conclude this with that full testimony of Maximus Tyrius to this purpose, quote, however, end quote, says he, quote, men may differ in other things, yet they all agree in this law or principle, that there is one God, King and Father of all things, etc. This the Greeks say, this the barbarians, this those that live upon the continent, and those that dwell by the sea, the wise and the unwise, end quote. Secondly, We have likewise a most ancient and credible history of the beginning of the world, I mean the history of Moses, with which no book in the world, in point of antiquity, can contend. I shall not now go about to strengthen my argument by pleading the divine authority of this book, for which yet I could offer good evidence, if that were proper to the matter in hand. It is sufficient to my present purpose that Moses have the ordinary credit of an historian given him, which none in reason can deny him, his being cited by the most ancient of the heathen historians, and the antiquity of his writings never questioned by any of them, as Josephus assures us. Now this history of Moses gives us a particular account of the beginning of the world, and of the creation of it by God, which assertion of his is agreeable to the most ancient writers among the heathen, whether poets or historians, and several of the main parts of Moses' history, as concerning the flood and the first fathers of the several nations of the world, of which he gives a particular account, Genesis chapter 10, do very well accord with the most ancient accounts of profane history, and I do not know whether anything ought more to recommend the writings of Moses to a human belief than the easy and credible account which he gives of the original of the world, and of the first peopling of it. As to the account of ancient times, both the Egyptian and Chaldean accounts, which are pretended by some to be so vastly different from that of the Scriptures, may for all that be, near the matter, easily reconciled with it, if we do but admit what Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch, very credible persons and diligent searchers into ancient books, do most expressly assure us, viz., that both those nations did anciently reckon months for years. And the account of the Chinese is not hard to be reconciled with that of the Septuagint. Now, in so nice and obscure a matter as the account of ancient times is, it ought to satisfy any fair and reasonable inquirer, if they can be brought any whit near one another. So that universal tradition and the most ancient history in the world are clearly on our side, and if they be, one can hardly wish a more convincing argument. For if the world, and consequently mankind, had a beginning, there is all the reason in the world to expect these two things. First, that there should be an universal tradition concerning this matter, because it was the most memorable thing that could be transmitted to posterity, and this was easy to be done, if mankind sprang from one common root and original, from whence this tradition would naturally be universally diffused. Secondly, it may with the same reason be expected that so remarkable a thing should be recorded in the most ancient history. Now both these have accordingly happened. But then, on the other hand, if the world was eternal and had no beginning, there could be no real ground for such a tradition or history, and if such a tradition were at any time endeavoured to be set on foot, it is not easy to imagine how it should at first gain entertainment, but much more difficult to conceive how ever it should come to be universally propagated. For, upon the supposition of those who hold the eternity of the world was always peopled, and, if so, there could be no common head or spring from whence such a tradition would naturally derive itself into all parts of the world, so that, unless all the world was some time of one language, and under one government, which it never was that we know of since it was peopled, no endeavour and industry could make such a tradition common. If it be said that this tradition began after some universal deluge, out of which possibly but one family might escape, and that possibly too a barbarous people, from whom any fond and groundless conceit might spring, and afterwards spread itself as mankind increased, this I shall have occasion to consider in a more proper place. In the meantime I have shown, even from the acknowledgment of Aristotle himself, that there was anciently such a tradition concerning the beginning of the world. Nay, if we may believe him, he himself was the very first ancestor of the eternity of the world, for he says expressly, quote, that all the philosophers that were before him did hold that the world was made, end quote. Thus much for the first kind of proof this matter is capable of, namely, testimony. Secondly, the probabilities of reason do all likewise favour the beginning of the world, as 1. The want of any history or tradition ancienter than what is consistent with the received opinion of the time of the world's beginning. Nay, the most ancient histories were written long after that time. This Lucretius, the famous Epicurean, urgeth as a strong presumption that the world had a beginning, i.e., if the world had no beginning, how is it that the Greek poets, the most ancient of their writers, mention nothing higher than the Theban war and the destruction of Troy? Were there from all eternity no memorable actions done till about that time? Or had mankind no way, till of late, to record them and propagate the memory of them to posterity? It is much, if men were from eternity, that they should not find out of the way of writing in all that long duration which had passed before that time. Sure he was a fortunate man indeed, who, after men had been eternally so dull as not to find it out, had the luck at last to hit upon it. But it may be the famous actions of former times were always recorded, but that the memorials of them have been several times lost by universal deluges, which have now and then happened and swept all away, except, it may be, 2 or 3 persons, that have escaped and begun the world again upon a new score. This is the only refuge that the atheist hath to fly to, when he is pressed with this and the like arguments. But he cannot possibly escape this way, for these universal inundations must either be natural or supernatural. If they be supernatural, as any man that considers well the frame of the world, and how hard it is to give a natural reason of them, would be inclined to think, then indeed it is easy to conceive how a few of mankind, and no more, should escape, because this will depend upon the pleasure of that superior being, which is supposed supernaturally to order these things. But this is to yield what we have all this while contended for, viz., that there is a God. But if they be natural, which the atheist must say, then there is nothing to restrain them from a total destruction, not only of mankind, but of all the beasts of the earth. This the atheist cannot deny, not only to be very possible, but exceeding probable, because he grants it to have come so near the matter that but very few escaped, and no doubt with great difficulty. Now it is the greatest wonder in the world that a thing, according to their own supposition, so likely to happen, should never have fallen out in an infinite duration. Will any man have the face to say that a thing is likely, which did never yet happen from all eternity? One would think that not only whatever is probable, but whatever can possibly happen, should be brought about in that space. So that if mankind had been from eternity, it had in all probability, I had almost said, been destroyed from all eternity, but I may confidently say, long since ruined. 2. Another probability of the world's beginning is the account which we have of the original of learning and the most useful arts in several parts of the world. Now, if the world had been eternal, these, in all likelihood, would have been found out, and generally spread long ago, and beyond the memory of all ages. There are some arts, indeed, that are peculiarly convenient to some particular nations, and others that are only serviceable to the humour and fashion of one or more ages. These are not likely to spread, and they may come in and go out, and return again, as often as there is occasion. But those which are generally useful to mankind, in all times and places, if they were once found out, and who would not think they should in an eternal duration, it is not imaginable but that they should have been spread innumerable ages since. Nor can any man give a good reason how they should ever be lost, but by some such accident as an universal deluge, which has been spoken to already. But now, on the contrary, the beginnings of learning and of the most useful arts, in several nations, is very well known. And I add further, that wherever learning and civil arts have come, this tradition concerning the beginning of the world hath been most vigorous, and asserted with the greatest clearness and confidence. 3. The several parts of which the world consists, being, so far as by those parts of it which we know we can possibly judge of the rest, in their nature corruptible, it is more than probable that in an infinite duration this frame of things would long since have been dissolved, especially if, as the atheist affirms, there be no superior being, no wise and intelligent principle, to repair and regulate it, and to prevent those innumerable disorders and calamitous accidents, which must in so long a space in all probability have happened to it. This Lucretius also urges as a convincing proof that the world was not eternal. Quote, "It must necessarily," end quote, says he, quote, "be acknowledged that the world had a beginning. Otherwise, those things which are in their own nature corruptible had never been able, from all eternity, to have held out against those forcible and violent assaults, which in an infinite duration must have happened." Nay, thus much Aristotle himself everywhere grants, that if the frame of the world be liable to dissolution, it must of necessity be acknowledged to have had a beginning. These are some of the chief probabilities on our side, which, being taken together, and in their united force, have a great deal of conviction in them, especially if this be added, that there is no kind of positive proof so much as pretended on the other side. The utmost that Aristotle pretends to prove is, that the world proceeded from God by the way of a natural and necessary effect, as light does from the sun, which, if it be true, as there is no tolerable ground for it, the world indeed would be without beginning, but not of itself. And thus I have done with the first consideration I propounded to speak to, viz., that there are fair proofs on our side, and as convincing as the nature of the thing is capable of, but that there is no pretence of proof on the other. I proceed, therefore, to the second consideration, that the most pressing difficulties are on that side on which there is no proof. Those who deny a God, and hold the world to have been eternal and of itself, have only two things to object against us: the difficulties that there are in the notion of a God, and in making the world of nothing. To the first I answer, that we attribute nothing to God that hath any repugnancy or contradiction in it. Power, wisdom, goodness, justice, and truth have no repugnancy in them to our reason, because we own these perfections to be in some degree in ourselves, and therefore they may be in the highest degree that is possible in another. The eternity of God, and his immensity, and his being of himself, how difficult soever they may be to be conceived, yet these perfections must be granted to be somewhere, and therefore they may as well, nay, much better, be ascribed to God, in whom we suppose all other perfections to meet, than to anything else. And as for God's being a spirit, whatever difficulty there may be in conceiving the notion of a spirit, yet the atheist must grant the thing, that there is a being or principle really distinct from matter, or else show how mere matter, which is confessed by themselves to be void of sense and understanding, and to move necessarily, can produce anything that has sense, understanding, and liberty. As to the other difficulty of making the world of nothing, I shall only say this, that though it signify an inconceivable excess of power, yet there can no contradiction be shown in it, and it is every whit as easy to conceive that something should be caused to be that was not before, as that anything should be of itself, which yet must be granted on both sides, and therefore this difficulty ought not to be objected by either. But then, on the other side, there are these two great and real difficulties. First, that men generally have always believed the contrary, viz., that the world had a beginning and was made by God, which is a strong evidence that this account of the existence of the world is more natural and of a more easy conception to human understanding. And indeed it is very natural to conceive that everything which is imperfect, as the world and all the creatures in it must be acknowledged in many respects to be, had some cause which produced it, such as it is, and determined the bounds and limits of its perfection. But that which is of itself, and without a cause, may be anything, and have any perfection which does not imply a contradiction. Secondly, to assert mankind to have been of itself, and without a cause, hath this invincible objection against it, that we plainly see every man to be from another, so that mankind is asserted to have no cause of its being, and yet every particular man must be acknowledged to have a father, which is every whit as absurd in an infinite succession of men as in any finite number of generations. It is more easy indeed to conceive how a constant and permanent being, suppose matter, should always have been of itself, and then that should be the foundation of infinite successive changes and alternations. But an infinite succession of the generations of men without any permanent foundation is utterly unimaginable. If it be said that the earth was always, and in time did produce men, and that they ever since have produced one another, this is to run into one great absurdity of the Epicurean way, which shall be considered in its proper place. And thus I have endeavoured, as plainly and briefly as the nature of the argument would admit, to prove that the account which the Scripture gives of the existence of the world is most credible and agreeable to the reason of mankind, and that this first account, which the atheist gives of it, is altogether incredible. And now I expect, after all this, the atheist will complain that all that hath been said does not amount to a strict demonstration of the thing. It may be so, and if the atheist would undertake to demonstrate the contrary, there might be some reason for this complaint. In the meantime, I desire to know whether, when both sides are agreed that the world is, and that it must either have its original from God, or have been always of itself, and if it have been made evident that on one side there are fair proofs both from testimony and reason, and as convincing as the nature of the thing is capable of, and no pretence of proof on the other, and that the difficulties are most pressing on that side which is destitute of proof, I say, if this have been made evident, I desire to know whether this be not upon the matter as satisfactory to a wise man as a demonstration. For in this case there can be no doubt on which side the clear advantage of evidence lies, and consequently which way a prudent man ought to determine assent. I come now, in the second place, to consider the other account which another sort of atheists, those whom I call the Epicureans, do give of the existence of the world, and it is this: they suppose the matter, of which the world is constituted, to be eternal and of itself, and then an infinite empty space for the infinite little parts of this matter, which they call atoms, to move and play in, and that these, being always in motion, did, after infinite trials and encounters, without any counsel or design, and without the disposal and contrivance of any wise and intelligent being, at last by a lucky casualty entangle and settle themselves in this beautiful and regular frame of the world which we now see, and that the earth, being at first in its full vigour and fruitfulness, did then bring forth men and all other sorts of living creatures, as it does plants now. This is, in short, the Epicurean account of the original of the world. I appeal to any man of reason whether anything can be more unreasonable than obstinately to impute an effect to chance which carries, in the very face of it, all the arguments and characters of a wise design and contrivance. Was ever any considerable work, in which there was required a great variety of parts, and a regular and orderly disposition of those parts, done by chance? Will chance fit means to ends, and that in 10,000 instances, and not fail in any one? How often might a man, after he had jumbled a set of letters in a bag, fling them out upon the ground before they would fall into an exact poem, yea, or so much as make a good discourse in prose? And may not a little book be as easily made by chance as this great volume of the world? How long might a man be in sprinkling colours upon canvas with a careless hand, before they would happen to make the exact picture of a man? And is a man easier made by chance than his picture? How long might 20,000 blind men, which should be sent out from the several remote parts of England, wander up and down before they would all meet upon Salisbury Plains, and fall into rank and file in the order of an army? And yet this is much more easy to be imagined than how the innumerable blind parts of matter should rendezvous themselves into a world. A man that sees Henry VII's chapel at Westminster might with as good reason maintain, yea, with much better, considering the vast difference betwixt that little structure and the huge fabric of the world, that it was never contrived or built by any man, but that the stones did by chance grow into those curious figures into which they seem to have been cut and graven, and that upon a time, as tales usually begin, the materials of that building, the stone, mortar, timber, iron, lead, and glass, happily met together, and very fortunately ranged themselves into that delicate order in which we see them now so closely compacted, that it must be a very great chance that parts them again. What would the world think of a man that should advance such an opinion as this, and write a book for it? If they would do him right, they ought to look upon him as mad, but yet with a little more reason than any man can have to say that the world was made by chance, or that the first men grew up out of the earth as plants do now. For can anything be more ridiculous and against all reason than to ascribe the production of men to the first fruitfulness of the earth, without so much as one instance and experiment in any age or history to countenance so monstrous a supposition? The thing is at first sight so gross and palpable that no discourse about it can make it more apparent. And yet these shameful beggars of principles, who give this precarious account of the original of things, assume to themselves to be the men of reason, the great wits of the world, the only cautious and wary persons that hate to be imposed upon, that must have convincing evidence for everything, and can admit of nothing without a clear demonstration for it. 2. Speculative atheism is unreasonable, because it gives no reasonable account of the universal consent of mankind in this apprehension that there is a God. That men do generally believe a God, and have done in all ages, the present experience of the world, and the records of former times, do abundantly testify. Now, how comes this persuasion to have gained so universal a possession of the mind of man, and to have found such general entertainment in all nations, even those that are most barbarous? If there be no such thing as God in the world, how comes it to pass that this object doth continually encounter our understandings? Whence is it that we are so perpetually haunted with the apparition of a deity, and followed with it wherever we go? If it be not natural to the mind of man, but proceeds from some accidental distemper of our understandings, how comes it to be so universal, that no difference of age, or temper, or education can wear it out, and set any considerable number of men free from it? Into what can we resolve this strong inclination of mankind to this error and mistake? How come all nations to be thus seduced? It is altogether unimaginable but that the reason of so universal a consent, in all places and ages of the world, and among all differences of persons, should be one and constant. But no one and constant reason of this can be given, but from the nature of man's mind and understanding, which hath this notion of a deity born with it and stamped upon it, or, which is all one, is of such a frame that in the free use and exercise of itself it will find out God. And what more reasonable than to think that if we be God's workmanship, he should set the mark of himself upon all reasonable creatures, that they may know to whom they belong, and may acknowledge the author of their beings. This seems to be a credible and satisfactory account of so universal a consent in this matter. But now, what doth the atheist resolve this into? He is not at one with himself what account to give of it, nor can it be expected he should. For he that will overlook the true reason of a thing, which usually is but one, may easily find many false ones, error being infinite. But there are three which he principally relies upon: fear, tradition, and policy of state. I shall briefly consider these. First, he would make us believe that this apprehension of a God doth spring from an infinite jealousy in the mind of man, and an endless fear of the worst that may happen, according to that divine saying of the poet, which he can never sufficiently admire, "Fear first made gods," so that it is granted on both sides that the fear of a deity doth universally possess the minds of men. Now the question is, whether it be more likely that the existence of a God should be the cause of this fear, or that this fear should be the cause why men imagine there is a God. If there be a God who hath impressed this image of himself upon the mind of man, there is great reason why all men should stand in awe of him. But if there be no God, it is not easy to conceive how fear should create an universal confidence and assurance in men that there is one. For whence should this fear come? It must be either from without, from the suggestion of others, who first tell us there is such a being, and then our fear believes it, or else it must arise from within, from the nature of man, which is apt to fancy dreadful and terrible things. If from the suggestion of others who tell us so, the question returns, who told them so? And will never be satisfied until the first author of this report be found out, so that this account of fear resolves itself into tradition, which shall be spoken to in its proper place. But if it be said that this fear ariseth from within, from the nature of man, which is apt to imagine dreadful things, this likewise is liable to inexplicable difficulties. For, first, the proper object of fear is something that is dreadful, that is, something that threatens men with harm or danger, and that in God must either be power or justice, and such an object as this fear indeed may create. But goodness and mercy are essential to the notion of a God, as well as power and justice. Now, how should fear put men upon fancying a being that is infinitely good and merciful? No man hath reason to be afraid of such a being as such. So that the atheist must join another cause to fear, viz., hope, to enable men to create this imagination of a God. And what would the product of these two contrary passions be? The imagination of a being which we should fear would do us as much harm as we could hope it would do us good, which would be quid pro quo, and which our reason would oblige us to lay aside so soon as we have fancied it, because it would signify just nothing. But, secondly, suppose fear alone could do it. How comes the mind of man to be subject to such groundless and unreasonable fears? The Aristotelian atheist will say, it always was so, but this is to affirm, and not to give any account of a thing. The Epicurean atheist, if he will speak consonantly to himself, must say that there happened in the original constitution of the first men such a contexture of atoms as doth naturally dispose men to these panic fears, unless he will say that the first men, when they grew out of the earth, and afterwards broke loose from their root, finding themselves weak and naked and unarmed, and meeting with several fierce creatures, stronger than themselves, they were put into such a fright as did a little distemper their understandings, and let loose their imaginations to endless suspicions and unbounded jealousies, which did at last settle in the conceit of an invincible being, infinitely powerful, and able to do them harm. And being fully possessed with this apprehension, nothing being more ordinary than for crazed persons to believe their own fancies, they became religious, and afterwards, when mankind began to be propagated in the way of generation, then religion obliged them to instill these principles into their children in their tender years, that so they might make the greater impression upon them. And this course having been continued ever since, the notion of a God hath been kept up in the world. This is very suitable to Epicurus's hypothesis of the original of men. But if any man think fit to say thus, I cannot think it fit to confute him. Thirdly, whether men were from all eternity such timorous and fanciful creatures, or happened to be made so in the first constitution of things, it seems, however, that this fear of a deity hath a foundation in nature, and if it be natural, ought we not rather to conclude that there is some ground and reason for these fears, and that nature hath not planted them in us to no purpose, than that they are vain and groundless? There is no principle that Aristotle, the great asserter of the eternity of the world, doth more frequently inculcate than this, that nature doth nothing in vain, and the atheist himself is forced to acknowledge, and so every man must who attentively considers the frame of the world, that although things were made by chance, yet they have happened as well as if the greatest wisdom had the ordering and contriving of them. And surely wisdom would never have planted such a vain principle as the fear of a deity in the nature of man, if there had not been a God in the world. Secondly, if fear be not a sufficient account of this universal consent, the atheist thinks it may very probably be resolved into universal tradition. But this likewise is liable to great exception, for whence came this tradition? It must begin sometime. It must have its original from somebody, and it were very well worth our knowing who that man was, that first raised this spirit, which all the reason of mankind could never conjure down since. Where did he live, and when? In what country, and in what age of the world? What was his name, or his son's name, that we may know him? This the atheist can give no punctual account of, only he imagines it not improbable that somebody long ago, nobody knows when, beyond the memory of all ages, did start such a notion in the world, and that it hath passed for current ever since. But if this tradition be granted so very ancient as to have been before all books, and to be older than any history, it may, for anything anybody can tell, have been from the beginning, and then it is much more likely to be a notion which was bred in the mind of man and born with him, than a tradition transmitted from hand to hand through all generations, especially if we consider how many rude and barbarous nations there are in the world, which consent in the opinion of a God, and yet have scarce any certain tradition of anything that was done among them but 2 or 3 ages before. Thirdly, but if neither of these be satisfactory, he hath one way more, which, although it signify little to men of sober and severe reason, yet it very unhappily hits the jealous and auspicious humour of the generality of men, who, from the experience they have had of themselves and others, are very apt to suspect that everybody, but especially their superiors and governors, have a design to impose upon them for their own ends. In short, it is this, that this noise about a God is a mere state engine and a politic device, invented at first by some great prince or minister of state, to keep people in awe and order. And, if so, from hence, saith the atheist, we may easily apprehend how from such an original it might be generally propagated and become universally current, having the stamp of public authority upon it. Besides, that people have always been found easy to comply with the inclinations of their prince. And from hence likewise we may see the reason why this notion hath continued so long, for, being found by experience to be so excellent an instrument of government, we may be sure it would always be cherished and kept up. And now he triumphs, and thinks the business is very clear. Thus it was, some time or other, most probably towards the beginning of the world, if it had a beginning, when all mankind were under one universal monarch, some great Nebuchadnezzar set up this image of a deity, and commanded all people and nations to fall down and worship it. And this being found a successful device to awe people into obedience to government, it hath been continued to this day, and is like to last to the end of the world. To this fine conjecture I have 4 things to say. 1. That all this is mere conjecture and supposition. He cannot bring the least shadow of proof or evidence for any one tittle of it. 2. This supposition grants the opinion of a God to conduce very much to the support of government and order in the world, and consequently to be very beneficial to mankind, so that the atheist cannot but acknowledge that it is a great pity that it should not be true, and that it is the common interest of mankind, if there were but probable arguments for it, not to admit of any slight reason against it, and to punish all those who would seduce men to atheism as the great disturbers of the world and pests of human society. 3. This supposition can have nothing of certainty in it, unless this be true, that whoever makes a politic advantage of other men's principles ought to be presumed to contrive those principles into them, whereas it is much more common, because more easy, for men to serve their own ends of those principles or opinions which they do not put into men, but find there. So that if the question of a God were to be decided by the probability of this conjecture, which the atheist applauds himself most in, it would be concluded in the affirmative, it being much more likely, since politicians reap the advantages of obedience, and a more ready submission to government from men's believing that there is a God, that they found the minds of men prepossessed to their hands with the notion of a God, than that they planted it there. 4. We have as much evidence of the contrary to this supposition as such a thing is capable of, viz., that it was not an arcanum imperii, a secret of government, to propagate the belief of a God among the people, when the governors themselves knew it to be a cheat. For we find in the histories of all ages, of which we have any records, and of other ages we cannot possibly judge, that princes have not been more secure from troubles of conscience and the fears of religion and the terrors of another world, nay, many of them more subject to these, than other men, as I could give many instances, and those no mean ones. What made Caligula creep under that bed when it thundered? What made Tiberius, that great master of the crafts of government, complain so much of the grievous stings and lashes he felt in his conscience? What made Cardinal Wolsey, that great minister of state in our own nation, to pour forth his soul in those sad words, quote, "Had I been as diligent to please my God as I have been to please my king, he would not have forsaken me now in my grey hairs," end quote. What reason for such actions and speeches, if these great men had known that religion was but a cheat? But if they knew nothing of this secret, I think we may safely conclude that the notion of a God did not come from the court, that it was not the invention of politicians, and a juggle of state to cozen the people into obedience. And now from all this that hath been said, it seems to be very evident that the general consent of mankind in this apprehension that there is a God must in all reason be ascribed to some more certain and universal cause than fear or tradition, or state policy, viz., to this, that God himself hath wrought this image of himself upon the mind of man, and so woven it into the very frame of his being that, like Phidias' picture in Minerva's shield, it can never totally be defaced without the ruin of human nature. I know but one objection that this discourse is liable to, which is this, that the universal consent of mankind in the apprehension of a God is no more an argument that he really is, than the general agreement of so many nations for so many ages in the worship of many gods is an argument that there are many. To this I answer, 1. That the generality of the philosophers and wise men of all nations and ages did dissent from the multitude in these things. They believed but one supreme deity, which, with respect to the various benefits men received from him, had several titles bestowed upon him. And although they did servilely comply with the people in worshipping God by sensible images and representations, yet it appears by their writings that they despised this way of worship as superstitious and unsuitable to the nature of God, so that polytheism and idolatry are far from being able to pretend to universal consent, from their having had the vote of the multitude in most nations for several ages together, because the opinion of the vulgar, separated from the consent and approbation of the wise, signifies no more than a great many ciphers would do without figures. 2. The gross ignorance and mistakes of the heathen about God and his worship are a good argument that there is a God, because they show that men, sunk into the most degenerate condition, into the greatest blindness and darkness imaginable, do yet retain some sense and awe of a deity, that religion is a property of our natures, and that the notion of a deity is intimate to our understandings, and sticks close to them, seeing men will rather have any God than none, and rather than want a deity they will worship anything. 3. That there have been so many false gods devised is rather an argument that there is a true one than that there is none. There would be no counterfeits but for the sake of something that is real. For though all pretenders seem to be what they really are not, yet they pretend to be something that really is. For to counterfeit is to put on the likeness and appearance of some real excellence. There would be no brass money if there were not good and lawful money. Bristol stones would not pretend to be diamonds if there never had been any diamonds. Those idols in Henry VII's time, as Sir Francis Bacon calls them, Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, had never been set up if there had not once been a real Plantagenet and Duke of York. So the idols of the heathen, though they be set up in affront to the true God, yet they rather prove that there is one than the contrary. 3. Speculative atheism is absurd because it requires more evidence for things than they are capable of. Aristotle hath long since well observed how unreasonable it is to expect the same kind of proof and evidence for everything which we have for some things. Mathematical things, being of an abstracted nature, are capable of the clearest and strictest demonstration, but conclusions in natural philosophy are capable of proof by an induction of experiments, things of a moral nature by moral arguments, and matters of fact by credible testimony. And though none of these be capable of that strict kind of demonstration, which mathematical matters are, yet have we an undoubted assurance of them, when they are proved by the best arguments that things of that kind will bear. No man can demonstrate to me, unless we will call every argument that is fit to convince a wise man a demonstration, that there is such an island in America as Jamaica. Yet, upon the testimony of credible persons who have seen it, and authors who have written of it, I am as free from all doubt concerning it as I am from doubting of the clearest mathematical demonstration. So that this is to be entertained as a firm principle by all those who pretend to be certain of anything at all, that when anything, in any of these kinds, is proved by as good argument as a thing of that kind is capable of, and we have as great assurance that it is, as we could possibly have supposing it were, we ought not in reason to make any doubt of the existence of that thing. Now, to apply this to the present case, the being of a God is not mathematically demonstrable, nor can it be expected it should, because only mathematical matters admit of this kind of evidence, nor can it be proved immediately by sense, because God, being supposed to be a pure spirit, cannot be the object of any corporeal sense. But yet we have as great assurance that there is a God as the nature of the thing to be proved is capable of, and as we could in reason expect to have, supposing that he were. For let us suppose there was such a being as an infinite spirit, clothed with all possible perfection, that is, as good and wise and powerful, etc., as can be imagined. What conceivable ways are there, whereby we should come to be assured that there is such a being, but either by an internal impression of the notion of a God upon our minds, or else by such external and visible effects as our reason tells us must be attributed to some cause, and which we cannot without great violence to our understandings attribute to any other cause but such a being as we conceive God to be, that is, one that is infinitely good and wise and powerful. Now we have this double assurance that there is a God, and greater or other than this the thing is not capable of. If God should assume a body and present himself before our eyes, this might amaze us, but could not give us any rational assurance that there is an infinite spirit. If he should work a miracle, this could not in reason convince an atheist more than the arguments he already hath for it. If the atheist then were to ask a sign in the heaven above, or in the earth beneath, what could he desire God to do for his conviction more than he hath already done? Could he desire him to work a greater miracle than to make a world? Why, if God should carry this perverse man out of the limits of this world, and show him a new heaven and a new earth, springing out of nothing, he might say that innumerable parts of matter chanced just then to rally together, and to form themselves into this new world, and that God did not make it. Thus you see that we have all the rational assurance of a God that the thing is capable of, and that atheism is absurd and unreasonable in requiring more. 4. The atheist is unreasonable because he pretends to know that which no man can know, and to be certain of that which nobody can be certain of, that is, that there is no God, and which is consequent upon this, as I shall show afterwards, that it is not possible there should be one. And the atheist must pretend to know this certainly, for it were the greatest folly in the world for a man to deny and despise a God, if he be not certain that he is not. Now whoever pretends to be certain that there is no God hath this great disadvantage. He pretends to be certain of a pure negative. But of negatives we have far the least certainty, and they are usually hardest, and many times impossible to be proved. Indeed, such negatives as only deny some particular mode or manner of a thing's existence, a man may have a certainty of them, because, when we see things to be, we may see what they are, and in what manner they do or do not exist. For instance, we may be certain that man is not a creature that hath wings, because this only concerns the manner of his existence, and we, seeing what he is, may certainly know that he is not so or so. But pure negatives, that is, such as absolutely deny the existence of things, or the possibility of their existence, can never be proved. For, after all that can be said against a thing, this will still be true, that many things possibly are which we know not of, and that many more things may be than are. And, if so, after all our arguments against a thing, it will be uncertain whether it be or not. And this is universally true, unless the thing denied to be do plainly imply a contradiction, from which I have already shown the notion of a God to be free. Now the atheist pretends to be certain of a pure negative, that there is no such being as God, and that it is not possible there should be. But no man can reasonably pretend to know thus much, but he must pretend to know all things that are or can be, which, if any man should be so vain as to pretend to, yet it is to be hoped that nobody would be so weak as to believe him. 5. Speculative atheism is unreasonable because it contradicts itself. There is this great contradiction in the denial of a God. He that denies a God says that it is impossible, which yet he must grant to be possible. He says it is impossible that there should be such a being as God, in saying that, de facto, there is no such being. For eternity being essential to the notion of a God, if there be not a God already, it is impossible now that there should be one, because such a being, as is supposed to be essentially eternal and without beginning, cannot now begin to be, and yet he must grant it possible that there should be such a being as hath all possible perfection, and such a being as this is that which we call God, and is that very thing which the atheist denies, and others affirm to be. For he that denies a God must deny such a being as all the world describe God to be, and this is the general notion which all men have of God, that he is a being as perfect as is possible, that is, endued with all such perfections as do not imply a contradiction, which none of those perfections which we attribute to God do, as I have already proved. 2. Speculative atheism, as it is unreasonable, so it is most imprudent and uncomfortable opinion, and that upon these two accounts. First, because it is against the present interest and happiness of mankind. Secondly, because it is infinitely hazardous and unsafe in the issue. 1. It is against the present interest and happiness of mankind. If atheism were the general opinion of the world, it would be infinitely prejudicial to the peace and happiness of human society, and would open a wide door to all manner of confusion and disorder. But this I shall not now insist upon, because I design a particular discourse of that by itself. I shall at present content myself to show how uncomfortable an opinion this would be to particular persons, for nothing can be more evident than that man is not sufficient of himself to his own happiness. He is liable to many evils and miseries which he can neither prevent nor redress. He is full of wants which he cannot supply, and compassed about with infirmities which he cannot remove, and obnoxious to dangers which he can never sufficiently provide against. Consider man without the protection and conduct of a superior being, and he is secure of nothing that he enjoys in this world, and uncertain of everything that he hopes for. He is apt to grieve for what he cannot help, and eagerly to desire what he is never likely to obtain. Quote, Man walketh in a vain show, and disquieteth himself in vain. End quote. He courts happiness in 1,000 shapes, and the faster he pursues it, the faster it flies from him. His hopes and expectations are bigger than his enjoyments, and his fears and jealousies more troublesome than the evils themselves which he is so much afraid of. He is liable to a great many inconveniences every moment of his life, and is continually insecure, not only of the good things of this life, but even of life itself. And besides all this, after all his endeavours to the contrary, he finds himself naturally to dread a superior being, that can defeat all his designs, and disappoint all his hopes, and make him miserable beyond all his fears. He has oftentimes secret misgivings concerning another life after this, and fearful apprehensions of an invisible judge, and thereupon he is full of anxiety concerning his condition in another world, and sometimes plunged into that anguish and despair that he grows weary of himself, so that the atheist deprives himself of all the comfort that the apprehensions of a God can give a man, and yet is liable to all the trouble and disquiet of those apprehensions. I do not say that these inconveniences do happen to all, but every one is in danger of them, for man's nature is evidently so contrived as does plainly discover how unable he is to make himself happy, so that he must necessarily look abroad and seek for happiness somewhere else. And if there be no superior being, in whose care of him he may repose his confidence and quiet his mind, if he have no comfortable expectations of another life to sustain him under the evils and calamities he is liable to in this world, he is certainly of all creatures the most miserable. There are none of us but may happen to fall into those circumstances of danger, or want, or pain, or some other sort of calamity, that we can have no hopes of relief or comfort but from God alone, none in all the world to flee to but him. And what would men do in such a case if it were not for God? Human nature is most certainly liable to desperate exigencies, and he is not happy that is not provided against the worst that may happen. It is bad to be reduced to such a condition as to be destitute of all comfort, and yet men are many times brought to that extremity, that if it were not for God, they would not know what to do with themselves, or how to enjoy themselves for 1 hour, or to entertain their thoughts with any comfortable considerations under their present anguish and sufferings. All men naturally fly to God in extremity, and the most atheistical person in the world, when he is forsaken of all hopes of any other relief, is forced to acknowledge him, and would be glad to have such a friend. Can it then be a wise and reasonable design to endeavour to banish this belief of a God out of the world? Not to say how impious it is in respect of God, nothing can be more malicious to men, and more effectually undermine the only foundation of our happiness. For if there were no God in the world, man would be in a much more wretched and disconsolate condition than the creatures below him. For they are only sensible of present pain, and when it is upon them they bear it as they can. But they are not at all apprehensive of evils at a distance, nor tormented with the fearful prospect of what may befall them hereafter, nor are they plunged into despair upon the consideration that the evils they lie under are like to continue, and are incapable of a remedy. And as they have no apprehension of these things, so they need no comfort against them. But mankind is liable to all the same evils and many others, which are so much the greater, because they are aggravated and set on by the restless workings of our minds, and exasperated by the smart reflections and frettings of our own thoughts. And if there be no God, we are wholly without comfort under all these, and without any other remedy than what time will give. For if the providence of God be taken away, what security have we against those innumerable dangers and mischiefs to which human nature is continually exposed? What consolation under them, when we are reduced to that condition that no creature can give us any hopes of relief? But if we believe that there is a God that takes care of us, and we be careful to please him, this cannot but be a mighty comfort to us, both under the present sense of affliction and the apprehension of evils at a distance. For, in that case, we are secure of one of these three things: either that God by his providence will prevent the evils we fear, if that be best for us, or that he will support us under them when they are present, and add to our strength as he increaseth our burden, or that he will make them the occasion of a greater good to us, by turning them either to our advantage in this world, or the increase of our happiness in the next. Now, every one of these considerations has a great deal of comfort in it, for which, if there were no God, there could be no ground. Nay, on the contrary, the most real foundation of our unhappiness would be laid in our reason, and we should be so much more miserable than the beasts, by how much we have a quicker apprehension and a deeper consideration of things. So that if a man had arguments sufficient to persuade him that there is no God, as there is infinite reason to the contrary, yet the belief of a God is so necessary to the comfort and happiness of our lives, that a wise man could not but be heartily troubled to quit so pleasant an error, and to part with a delusion which is apt to yield such unspeakable satisfaction to the mind of man. Did but men consider the true notion of God, he would appear to be so lovely a being, so full of goodness and of all desirable perfections, that even those very persons who are of such irregular understandings as not to believe that there is a God, yet could not, if they understood themselves, refrain from wishing with all their hearts that there were one. For is it not really desirable to every man that there should be such a being in the world as takes care of the frame of it, that it do not run into confusion, and in that disorder ruin mankind? That there should be such a being as takes particular care of every one of us, and loves us, and delights to do us good, as understands all our wants, and is able and willing to relieve us in our greatest straits, when nothing else can, to preserve us in our greatest dangers, to assist us against our worst enemies, and to comfort us under our sharpest sufferings, when all other things set themselves against us? Is it not every man's interest that there should be such a governor of the world as really designs our happiness, and hath omitted nothing that is necessary to it, as would govern us for our advantage, and will require nothing of us but what is for our good, and yet will infinitely reward us for the doing of that which is best for ourselves? That will punish any man that should go about to injure us, or to deal otherwise with us than himself in the like case would be dealt withal by us? In a word, such a one as is ready to be reconciled to us when we have offended him, and is so far from taking little advantages against us for every failing, that he is willing to pardon our most wilful miscarriages upon our repentance and amendment. And we have reason to believe God to be such a being, if he be at all. Why then should any man be troubled that there is such a being as this, or think himself concerned to shut him out of the world? How could such a governor as this be wanting in the world, that is so great a comfort and security to mankind, and the confidence of all the ends of the earth? If God be such a being as I have described, Woe to the world if it were without him! This would be 1,000 times greater loss to mankind, and of more dismal consequences, and, if it were true, ought to affect us with more grief and horror than the extinguishing of the sun. Let but all things be well considered, and I am very confident that if a wise and considerate man were left to himself and his own choice, to wish the greatest good to himself he could devise, after he had searched heaven and earth, the sum of all his wishes would be this, that there were just such a being as God is, nor would he choose any other benefactor, or friend, or protector for himself, or governor for the whole world, than infinite power conducted and managed by infinite wisdom, and goodness and justice, which is the true notion of God. Nay, so necessary is God to the happiness of mankind, that though there were no God, yet the atheist himself, upon second thoughts, would judge it convenient that the generality of men should believe that there is one. For when the atheist had attained his end, and, if it were a thing possible, had blotted the notion of a God out of the minds of men, mankind would in all probability grow so melancholy and so unruly a thing, that he himself would think it fit in policy to contribute his best endeavours to the restoring of men to their former belief. Thus hath God secured the belief of himself in the world, against all attempts to the contrary, not only by riveting the notion of himself into our natures, but likewise by making the belief of his being necessary to the peace and tranquillity of our minds, and to the quiet and happiness of human society. So that, if we consult our reason, we cannot but believe that there is; if our interest, we cannot but heartily wish that there were such a being as God in the world. Everything within us and without us gives notice of him. His name is written upon our hearts, and in every creature there are some prints and footsteps of him. Every moment we feel our dependence upon him, and do by daily experience find that we can neither be happy without him, nor think ourselves so. I confess it is not a wicked man's interest, if he resolve to continue such, that there should be a God, but then it is not men's interest to be wicked. It is for the general good of human society, and consequently of particular persons, to be true and just. It is for men's health to be temperate, and so I could instance in all other virtues. But this is the mystery of atheism. Men are wedded to their lusts, and resolved upon a wicked course, and so it becomes their interest to wish there were no God, and to believe so if they can. Whereas, if men were minded to live righteously and soberly and virtuously in the world, to believe a God would be no hindrance or prejudice to any such design, but very much for the advancement and furtherance of it. Men that are good and virtuous do easily believe a God, so that it is vehemently to be suspected that nothing but the strength of men's lusts, and the power of vicious inclinations, do sway their minds, and set a bias upon their understandings toward atheism. 2. Atheism is imprudent, because it is unsafe in the issue. The atheist contends against the religious man that there is no God, but upon strange inequality and odds, for he ventures his eternal interest, whereas the religious man ventures only the loss of his lusts, which it is much better for him to be without, or at the utmost of some temporal convenience, and all this while is inwardly more contented and happy, and usually more healthful, and perhaps meets with more respect and faithfuler friends, and lives in a more secure and flourishing condition, and more free from the evils and punishments of this world, than the atheistical person does. However, it is not much that he ventures, and after this life, if there be no God, is as well as he, but if there be a God, is infinitely better, even as much as unspeakable and eternal happiness is better than extreme and endless misery. So that, if the arguments for and against a God were equal, and it were an even question whether there were one or not, yet the hazard and danger is so infinitely unequal, that in point of prudence and interest every man were obliged to incline to the affirmative, and, whatever doubts he might have about it, to choose the safest side of the question, and to make that the principle to live by. For he that acts wisely, and is a thoroughly prudent man, will be provided against all events, and will take care to secure the main chance, whatever happens. But the atheist, in case things should fall out contrary to his belief and expectation, hath made no provision for this case. If, contrary to his confidence, it should prove in the issue that there is a God, the man is lost and undone forever. If the atheist, when he dies, should find that his soul remains after his body, and has only quitted its lodging, how will this man be amazed and blanked, when, contrary to his expectation, he shall find himself in a new and strange place, amidst a world of spirits, entered upon an everlasting and unchangeable state? How sadly will the man be disappointed when he finds all things otherwise than he had stated and determined them in this world, when he comes to appear before that God, whom he hath denied, and against whom he hath spoken as despiteful things as he could. Who can imagine the pale and guilty looks of this man, and how he will shiver and tremble for the fear of the Lord, and for the glory of his majesty? How will he be surprised with terrors on every side, to find himself thus unexpectedly and irrecoverably plunged into a state of ruin and desperation? And thus things may happen for all this man's confidence now. For our belief or disbelief of a thing does not alter the nature of the thing. We cannot fancy things into being, or make them vanish into nothing by the stubborn confidence of our imaginations. Things are as sullen as we are, and will be what they are whatever we think of them. And if there be a God, a man cannot by an obstinate disbelief of him make him cease to be, any more than a man can put out the sun by winking. And thus I have, as briefly and clearly as I could, endeavoured to show the ignorance and folly of speculative atheism in denying the existence of God. And now it will be less needful to speak of the other two principles of religion, the immortality of the soul and future rewards. For no man can have any reasonable scruple about these who believes that there is a God, because no man that owns the existence of an infinite spirit can doubt of the possibility of a finite spirit, that is, such a thing as is immaterial, and does not contain any principle of corruption in itself. And there is no man that believes the goodness of God, but must be inclined to think that he hath made some things for as long a duration as they are capable of. Nor can any man that acknowledgeth the holy and just providence of God, and that he loves righteousness and hates iniquity, and that he is a magistrate and governor of the world, and consequently concerned to countenance the obedience and to punish the violation of his laws, and that does withal consider the promiscuous dispensations many times of God's providence in this world, I say, no man that acknowledges all this can think it unreasonable to conclude that, after this life, good men shall be rewarded and sinners punished. I have done with the first sort of irreligious persons, the speculative atheist. I shall speak but briefly of the other. Secondly, the practical atheist, who is wicked and irreligious, notwithstanding he does in some sort believe that there is a God and a future state. He is likewise guilty of prodigious folly. The principle of the speculative atheist argues more ignorance, but the practice of the other argues greater folly. Not to believe a God and another life, for which there is so much evidence of reason, is great ignorance and folly. But it is the highest madness, when a man does believe these things, to live as if he did not believe them. When a man does not doubt but that there is a God, and that according as he demeans himself towards him, he will make him happy or miserable for ever, yet to live so as if he were certain of the contrary, and as no man in reason can live, but he that is well assured that there is no God. It was a shrewd saying of the old monk, that two kinds of prisons would serve for all offenders in the world, an inquisition and a bedlam. If any man should deny the being of a God and the immortality of the soul, such a one should be put into the first of these, the inquisition, as being a desperate heretic. But if any man should profess to believe these things, and yet allow himself in any known wickedness, such a one should be put into bedlam, because there cannot be a greater folly and madness than for a man in matters of greatest moment and concernment to act against his best reason and understanding, and by his life to contradict his belief. Such a man does perish with his eyes open, and knowingly undoes himself. He runs upon the greatest dangers which he clearly sees to be before him, and precipitates himself into those evils which he professes to believe to be real and intolerable, and wilfully neglects the obtaining of that unspeakable good and happiness which he is persuaded is certain and attainable. Thus much for the second way of confirmation. 3. The third way of confirmation shall be, by endeavouring to vindicate religion from those common imputations which seem to charge it with ignorance or imprudence, and they are chiefly these three. 1. Credulity. 2. Singularity. 3. Making a foolish bargain. First, credulity. Say they, the foundation of religion is the belief of those things for which we have no sufficient reason, and consequently of which we can have no good assurance, as the belief of a God and of a future state after this life, things which we never saw, nor did experience, nor ever spake with anybody that did. Now it seems to argue too great a forwardness and easiness of belief to assent to anything upon insufficient grounds. To this I answer, 1. That if there be such a being as a God, and such a thing as a future state after this life, it cannot, as I said before, in reason be expected that we should have the evidence of sense for such things. For he that believes a God believes such a being as hath all perfections, among which this is one, that he is a spirit, and consequently that he is invisible and cannot be seen. He likewise that believes another life after this professeth to believe a state, of which in this life we have no trial and experience. Besides, if this were a good objection, that no man ever saw these things, it strikes at the atheist as well as us. For no man ever saw the world to be from eternity, nor Epicurus's atoms, of which notwithstanding he believes the world was made. 2. We have the best evidence for these things which they are capable of at present, supposing they were. 3. Those who deny these principles must be much more credulous, that is, believe things upon incomparably less evidence of reason. The atheist looks upon all that are religious as a company of credulous fools, but he, for his part, pretends to be wiser than to believe anything for company. He cannot entertain things upon those slight grounds which move other men. If you would win his assent to anything, you must give him a clear demonstration for it. Now, there is no way to deal with this man of reason, this rigid exactor of strict demonstration for things which are not capable of it, but by showing him that he is 100 times more credulous, that he begs more principles, takes more things for granted without offering to prove them, and assents to more strange conclusions upon weaker grounds than those whom he so much accuseth of credulity. And, to evidence this, I shall briefly give you an account of the atheist's creed, and present you with a catalogue of the fundamental articles of his faith. He believes that there is no God, nor possibly can be, and consequently that the wise as well as unwise of all ages have been mistaken, except himself and a few more. He believes that either all the world have been frighted with an apparition of their own fancy, or that they have most unnaturally conspired together to cozen themselves, or that this notion of a God is a trick of policy, that the greatest princes and politicians do not at this day know so much, nor have done time out of mind. He believes either that the heavens and the earth, and all things in them, had no original cause of their being, or else that they were made by chance, and happened he knows not how to be as they are, and that in this last shuffling of matter, all things have by great good fortune fallen out as happily and as regularly as if the greatest wisdom had contrived them, but yet he is resolved to believe that there was no wisdom in the contrivance of them. He believes that matter of itself is utterly void of all sense, understanding, and liberty, but for all that, he is of opinion that the parts of matter may now and then happen to be so conveniently disposed as to have all these qualities, and most dexterously to perform all those fine and free operations which the ignorant attribute to spirits. This is the sum of his belief, and it is a wonder that there should be found any person pretending to reason or wit that can assent to such a heap of absurdities, which are so gross and palpable that they may be felt, so that if every man had his due, it will certainly fall to the atheist's share to be the most credulous person, that is, to believe things upon the slightest reasons. For he does not pretend to prove anything of all this, only he finds himself, he knows not why, inclined to believe so, and to laugh at those that do not. 2. The second imputation is singularity, the affectation whereof is unbecoming a wise man. To this charge I answer, 1. If by religion be meant the belief of the principles of religion, that there is a God and a providence, that our souls are immortal, and that there are rewards to be expected after this life, these are so far from being singular opinions, that they are and always have been the general opinion of mankind, even of the most barbarous nations, insomuch that the histories of ancient times do hardly furnish us with the names of above 5 or 6 persons who denied a God. And Lucretius acknowledgeth that Epicurus was the first who did oppose those great foundations of religion, the providence of God, and the immortality of the soul. 2. If by religion be meant a living up to those principles, that is, to act conformably to our best reason and understanding, and to live as it does become those who do believe a God and a future state, this is acknowledged, even by those who live otherwise, to be the part of every wise man, and the contrary to be the very madness of folly and height of distraction, nothing being more ordinary than for men who live wickedly to acknowledge that they ought to do otherwise. 3. Though according to the common course and practice of the world it be somewhat singular for men truly and thoroughly to live up to the principles of their religion, yet singularity in this matter is so far from being a reflection upon any man's prudence, that it is a singular commendation of it. In 2 cases singularity is very commendable. 1. When there is a necessity of it in order to a man's greatest interest and happiness. I think it to be a reasonable account for any man to give why he does not live as the greatest part of the world do, that he has no mind to die as they do, and to perish with them. He is not disposed to be a fool, and to be miserable for company. He has no inclination to have his last end like theirs who know not God, and obey not the gospel of his Son, and shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord, and from the glory of his power. 2. It is very commendable to be singular in any excellency, and I have shown that religion is the greatest excellency. To be singular in anything that is wise and worthy and excellent is not a disparagement, but a praise. Every man would choose to be thus singular. 3. The third imputation is that religion is a foolish bargain, because they who are religious hazard the parting with a present and certain happiness, for that which is future and uncertain. To this I answer, 1. Let it be granted that the assurance which we have of future rewards falls short of the evidence of sense. For I doubt not, but that saying of our Saviour, quote, "Blessed is he who hath believed and not seen," end quote, and those expressions of the Apostle, quote, "We walk by faith and not by sight," end quote, and, quote, "Faith is the evidence of things not seen," end quote, are intended by way of abatement and diminution to the evidence of faith, and do signify that the report and testimony of others is not so great evidence as that of our own senses. And though we have sufficient assurance of another state, yet no man can think we have so great evidence as if we ourselves had been in the other world, and seen how all things are there. 2. We have sufficient assurance of those things, and such as may beget in us a well-grounded confidence, and free us from all doubts of the contrary, and persuade a reasonable man to venture his greatest interests in this world upon the security that he hath of another. For 1. We have as much assurance of these things as things future and at a distance are capable of, and he is a very unreasonable man that would desire more. Future and invisible things are not capable of the evidence of sense, but we have the greatest rational evidence for them, and in this every reasonable man ought to rest satisfied. 2. We have as much as is abundantly sufficient to justify every man's discretion, who, for the great and eternal things of another world, hazards or parts with the poor and transitory things of this life. And for the clearing of this, it will be worth our considering that the greatest affairs of this world and the most important concernments of this life are all conducted only by moral demonstrations. Men every day venture their lives and estates only upon moral assurance. For instance, men who never were at the East or West Indies, or in Turkey or Spain, yet do venture their whole estate in traffic thither, though they have no mathematical demonstration, but only moral assurance, that there are such places. Nay, which is more, men every day eat and drink, though I think no man can demonstrate out of Euclid or Apollonius that his baker, brewer, or cook have not conveyed poison into his meat or drink. And that man that would be so wise and cautious as not to eat or drink until he could demonstrate this to himself, I know no other remedy for him, but that in great gravity and wisdom he must die for fear of death. And for any man to urge that, though men in temporal affairs proceed upon moral assurance, yet there is greater assurance required to make men see heaven and avoid hell, seems to me to be highly unreasonable. For such an assurance of things as will make men circumspect and careful to avoid a lesser danger, ought in all reason to awaken men much more to the avoiding of a greater. Such an assurance as will sharpen men's desires and quicken their endeavours for the obtaining of a lesser good, ought in all reason to animate men more powerfully, and to inspire them with a greater vigour and industry in the pursuit of that which is infinitely greater. For why the same assurance should not operate as well in a great danger as in a less, in a great good as in a small and inconsiderable one, I can see no reason, unless men will say that the greatness of an evil danger is an encouragement to men to run upon it, and that the greatness of any good and happiness ought in reason to dishearten them from the pursuit of it. And now I think I may with reason entreat such as are atheistically inclined to consider these things seriously and impartially, and if there be weight in these considerations, which I have offered to them to sway with reasonable men, I would beg of such that they would not suffer themselves to be biased by prejudice or passion, or the interest of any lust or worldly advantage, to a contrary persuasion. First, I would entreat them seriously and diligently to consider these things, because they are of so great moment and concernment to every man. If anything in the world deserve our serious study and consideration, these principles of religion do. For what can import us more to be satisfied in, than whether there be a God or not, whether our souls shall perish with our bodies, or be immortal and shall continue forever, and, if so, whether in that eternal state, which remains for men after this life, they shall not be happy or miserable forever, according as they have demeaned themselves in this world. If these things be so, they are of infinite consequence to us, and therefore it highly concerns us to inquire diligently about them, and to satisfy our minds concerning them one way or other. For these are not matters to be slightly and superficially thought upon, much less, as the way of atheistical men is, to be played and jested withal. There is no greater argument of a light and inconsiderate person than profanely to scoff at religion. It is a sign that that man hath no regard to himself, and that he is not touched with the sense of his own interest, who loves to be jesting with edged tools, and to play with life and death. This is the very madman that Solomon speaks of, quote, who casteth firebrands, arrows, and death, and saith, Am I not in sport? End quote. To examine severely and debate seriously the principles of religion is a thing worthy of a wise man. But if any man shall turn religion into raillery, and think to confute it by 2 or 3 bold jests, this man doth not render religion but himself ridiculous, in the opinion of all considerate men, because he sports with his own life. If the principles of religion were doubtful and uncertain, yet they concern us so nearly that we ought to be serious in the examination of them. And though they were never so clear and evident, yet they may be made ridiculous by vain and frothy men, as the gravest and wisest person in the world may be abused by being put into a fool's coat, and the most noble and excellent poem may be debased and made vile by being turned into burlesque. But of this I shall have occasion to speak more largely in my next discourse. So that it concerns every man that would not trifle away his soul, and fool himself into irrecoverable misery, with the greatest seriousness to inquire into these matters, whether they be so or not, and patiently to consider the arguments which are brought for them. For many have miscarried about these things, not because there is not reason and evidence enough for them, but because they have not had patience enough to consider them. Secondly, consider these things impartially. All wicked men are of a party against religion. Some lust or interest engageth them against it. Hence it comes to pass that they are apt to slight the strongest arguments that can be brought for it, and to cry up very weak ones against it. Men do generally and without difficulty assent to mathematical truths, because it is nobody's interest to deny them. But men are slow to believe moral and divine truths, because by their lusts and interest they are prejudiced against them. And therefore you may observe that the more virtuously any man lives, and the less he is enslaved to any lust, the more ready he is to entertain the principles of religion. Therefore, when you are examining these matters, do not take into consideration any sensual or worldly interest, but deal clearly and impartially with yourselves. Let not temporal and little advantages sway you against a greater and more durable interest. Think thus with yourselves, that you have not the making of things true or false, but that the truth and existence of things is already fixed and settled, and that the principles of religion are already either determinately true or false before you think of them. Either there is a God or there is not. Either your souls are immortal or they are not. One of these is certain and necessary, and is not now to be altered. The truth of things will not comply with our conceits, and bend itself to our interests. Therefore do not think what you would have to be, but consider impartially what is, and, if it be, will be, whether you will or no. Do not reason thus: I would fain be wicked, and therefore it is my interest that there should be no God, nor no life after this. And therefore I will endeavour to prove that there is no such thing, and will show all the favour I can to that side of the question. I will bend my understanding and wit to strengthen the negative, and will study to make it as true as I can. This is fond, because it is the way to cheat thyself, and that we may do as often as we please, but the nature of things will not be imposed upon. If then thou be as wise as thou oughtest to be, thou wilt reason thus with thyself: my highest interest is not to be deceived about these matters. Therefore, setting aside all other considerations, I will endeavour to know the truth, and yield to that. And now it is time to draw towards a conclusion of this long discourse, and that which I have all this while been endeavouring to convince men of, and to persuade them to, is no other but what God himself doth particularly recommend to us as proper for human consideration. Quote, unto man he said, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. End quote. Whoever pretends to reason, and calls himself a man, is obliged to acknowledge God, and to demean himself religiously towards him. For God is to the understanding of man as the light of the sun is to our eyes, the first and the plainest and the most glorious object of it. He fills heaven and earth, and everything in them does represent him to us. Which way soever we turn ourselves, we are encountered with clear evidences and sensible demonstrations of a deity. For, as the Apostle reasons, quote, the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. End quote. That is, those men that know not God have no apology to make for themselves. Or if men do know and believe that there is such a being as God, not to consider the proper consequences of such a principle, not to demean ourselves towards him as becomes our relation to him, and dependence upon him, and the duty which we naturally owe him, this is great stupidity and inconsiderateness. And yet he that considers the lives and actions of the greatest part of men would verily think that they understood nothing of all this. Therefore the Scripture represents wicked men as without understanding. Quote, it is a nation void of counsel, neither is there any understanding in them. End quote. And, elsewhere, quote, have all the workers of iniquity no knowledge? End quote. Not that they are destitute of the natural faculty of understanding, but they do not use it as they ought. They are not blind, but they wink. They detain the truth of God in unrighteousness. And though they know God, yet they do not glorify him as God, nor suffer the apprehensions of him to have a due influence upon their hearts and lives. Men generally stand very much upon the credit and reputation of their understandings, and of all things in the world hate to be accounted fools, because it is so great a reproach. The best way to avoid this imputation, and to bring off the credit of our understandings, is to be truly religious, to fear the Lord, and to depart from evil. For certainly there is no such imprudent person as he that neglects God and his soul, and is careless and slothful about his everlasting concernments, because this man acts contrary to his truest reason and best interest. He neglects his own safety, and is active to procure his own ruin. He flies from happiness and runs away from it as fast as he can, but pursues misery and makes haste to be undone. Hence it is that Solomon does all along in the Proverbs give the title of fool to a wicked man, as if it were his proper name and the fittest character of him, because he is so eminently such. There is no fool to the sinner, who every moment ventures his soul and lays his everlasting interest at the stake. Every time a man provokes God, he does the greatest mischief to himself that can be imagined. A madman that cuts himself, and tears his own flesh, and dashes his head against the stones, does not act so unreasonably as he, because he is not so sensible of what he does. Wickedness is a kind of voluntary frenzy and a chosen distraction, and every sinner does wilder and more extravagant things than any man can do that is crazed and out of his wits, only with this sad difference, that he knows better what he does. For to them who believe another life after this, an eternal state of happiness or misery in another world, which is but a reasonable postulatum or demand among Christians, there is nothing in mathematics more demonstrable than the folly of wicked men, for it is not a clearer and more evident principle that the whole is greater than a part, than that eternity and the concernments of it are to be preferred before time. I will, therefore, put the matter into a temporal case, that wicked men who understand anything of the rules and principles of worldly wisdom may see the imprudence of an irreligious and sinful course, and be convinced that their way is their folly, even themselves being judges. Is that man wise as to his body and his health, who only clothes his hands, but leaves his whole body naked, who provides only against the toothache, and neglects whole troops of mortal diseases that are ready to rush in upon him? Just thus does he who takes care only for this vile body, but neglects his precious and immortal soul, who is very solicitous to prevent small and temporal inconveniences, but takes no care to escape the damnation of hell. Is he a prudent man as to his temporal estate, that lays designs only for a day, without any prospect to, or provision for, the remaining part of his life? Even so does he that provides for the short time of his life, but takes no care for all eternity, which is to be wise for a moment, but a fool for ever, and to act as untowardly and as crossly to the reason of things as can be imagined, to regard time as if it were eternity, and to neglect eternity as if it were but a short time. Do we count him a wise man, who is wise in anything but in his own proper profession and employment, wise for everybody but himself, who is ingenious to contrive his own misery and to do himself a mischief, but is dull and stupid as to the designing of any real benefit and advantage to himself? Such a one is he, who is ingenious in his calling, but a bad Christian. For Christianity is more our proper calling and profession than the very trades we live upon, and such is every sinner, who is, quote, wise to do evil, but to do good hath no understanding, end quote. Is it wisdom in any man to neglect and disoblige him, who is his best friend, and can be his sorest enemy, or with one weak troop to go out to meet him that comes against him with thousands of thousands, to fly a small danger and run upon a greater? Thus does every wicked man that neglects and contemns God, who can save or destroy him, who strives with his Maker and provoketh the Lord to jealousy, and with the small and inconsiderable forces of a man takes the field against the mighty God, the Lord of hosts, who fears them that can kill the body, but after that have no more that they can do, but fears not him who after he hath killed can destroy both body and soul in hell. And thus does he who, for fear of anything in this world, ventures to displease God, for in so doing he runs away from men and falls into the hands of the living God. He flies from a temporal danger and leaps into hell. Is not he an imprudent man who, in matters of greatest moment and concernment, neglects opportunities never to be retrieved, who, standing upon the shore, and seeing the tide making haste towards him apace, and that he hath but a few minutes to save himself, yet will lay himself to sleep there till the cruel sea rush in upon him and overwhelm him? And is he any better, who trifles away this day of God's grace and patience, and foolishly adjourns the necessary work of repentance and the weighty business of religion to a dying hour? And, to put an end to these questions, is he wise, who hopes to attain the end without the means, nay, by means that are quite contrary to it? Such is every wicked man, who hopes to be blessed hereafter without being holy here, and to be happy, that is, to find a pleasure in the enjoyment of God and in the company of holy spirits, by rendering himself as unsuitable and unlike to them as he can. Wouldst thou then be truly wise? Be wise for thyself, wise for thy soul, wise for eternity. Resolve upon a religious course of life. Quote, fear God and depart from evil. End quote. Look beyond things present and sensible unto things which are not seen and are eternal. Labour to secure the great interests of another world, and refer all the actions of this short and dying life to that state which will shortly begin, but never have an end. And this will approve itself to be wisdom at the last, whatever the world judge of it now. For not that which is approved of men now, but what shall finally be approved by God, is true wisdom, that which is esteemed so by him, who is the fountain and original of all wisdom, the first rule and measure, the best and most competent judge of it. I deny not, but those that are wicked and neglect religion may think themselves wise, and may enjoy this their delusion for a while. But there is a time coming when the most profane and atheistical, who now account it a piece of gallantry, and an argument of a great spirit, and of a more than common wit and understanding, to slight God and to baffle religion, and to level all the discourses of another world with the poetical descriptions of the fairyland, I say there is a day coming when all those witty fools shall be unhappily undeceived, and, not being able to enjoy their delusion any longer, shall call themselves fools for ever. But why should I use so much importunity to persuade men to that which is so excellent, so useful, and so necessary? The thing itself hath allurements in it beyond all arguments. For if religion be the best knowledge and wisdom, I cannot offer anything beyond this to your understandings, to raise your esteem of it. I can present nothing beyond this to your affections, to excite your love and desire. All that can be done is to set the thing before men, and to offer it to their choice. And if men's natural desire of wisdom and knowledge and happiness will not persuade them to be religious, it is in vain to use arguments. If the sight of these beauties will not charm men's affections, it is to no purpose to go about to compel a liking, and to urge and push forward a match, to the making whereof consent is necessary. Religion is matter of our freest choice, and if men will obstinately and wilfully set themselves against it, there is no remedy. God has provided no remedy for the obstinacy of men, but if they will choose to be fools and to be miserable, he will leave them to inherit their own choice and to enjoy the portion of sinners.